Poker's legendary champions, next generation stars, and tireless ambassadors of the game, sharing their wisdom and guiding your journey to high achievement on the green felt. This is Chasing Poker Greatness with your host, Brad Wilson.
Welcome, my friend, to episode numero uno of Chasing Poker Greatness, the poker podcast that digs deep into the minds of poker legends, up-and-coming stars, and tireless ambassadors of the game. You'll hear it all in their own words as they explain the business of card playing from their point of view and let you in on their secrets for learning, training, playing, and constantly improving. This is your host, founder of EnhanceYourEdge.com, Brad Wilson, and I could not be more excited to share my conversation today with guest Matt Berkey, otherwise known simply as Berkey. He's been a professional player since 2003, who's known for battling in some of the highest of high-stakes games on the planet, and that is the way he likes it. He's gone from playing 1-2 and 2-5 games in college to claiming his seat among the world's elite in the famed Ivey's room, where he plays no-limit hold'em at stakes as high as 300, 600, 1200. Not just a nosebleed cash game crusher, Berkey also has $4 million in lifetime tournament winnings to go along with 6 WSOP final tables, despite playing a very limited tourney slate. He also loves to write, whether it be for his own blog, thevoicewithin.me, print and online magazines, or as a contributor to the Huffington Post. Being a man who thrives with multiple balls in the air, Berkey's also the founder of elite live cash game training site solveforwhyacademy.com. During our conversation today, we'll get Berkey's input on what it means to be not just a good player, but a good competitor on the green felt. He'll also talk about his feelings on moving up stakes, the fear of taking shots, and how to overcome that fear. He'll also provide invaluable insights into game theory, exploitative play, and how to make sure that you're always maximizing and increasing your edge. Aside from all that, he's got some incredible stories to tell as well. Like a lot of players in their poker career, Berkey has won and lost millions of dollars, with a notable point that sometimes he does it in only one hand. You'll hear how he deals with the stellar highs of raking in seven-figure pots, as well as the crushing lows of watching small fortunes being pushed in someone else's direction, and then being asked to pose for a picture with the dude that just won said fortune. There are few people in the poker world who can say they've seen and done as much as Berkey. He is truly a gift to the game, not just because he's one of the elite players in the universe, but also because he does everything in his power to give back to the great game of poker as well. So sit back, relax, and without any further ado, this is Berkey on Chasing Poker Greatness. Berkey, it's awesome having you on the show. How are you doing, sir?
Fantastic. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to get to meet you face to face for the first time.
Yeah, likewise. As I tend to do starting off this show, I'd like to ask you about your story, getting into playing cards. I know you got in 2003. Could you tell me how that happened?
Yeah, so I actually started playing long before that. In high school, I was playing just like quarter games with my friends, but we didn't know really much about No Limit. I'm from Pittsburgh, so a lot of the East Coast influence was coming through. We mostly played variations of stud games, and they were always like, these wild variations like Follow the Queen, Chicago. Basically, in any given game, there was going to be some subset of wild cards. And it was fun, and I won a lot. Looking back, I don't really know why. I'm sure it just had something to do with psychology, where like maybe I was more risk averse, or less risk averse rather, than my friends or whatever the case may be. But when I got into college, I've never drank in my life, and I played baseball. So, the peer pressure was almost double being a part of an athletic team. And my bridge for being the outsider, I guess, aside from just like being okay at baseball, was the fact that I played poker. So like as a freshman, I was the only one invited to the upperclassmen's game. And that was like a good social lubricant for me. By the time the moneymaker boom hit in 2003, I was a junior and, 21, in a position where I could start going to casinos and things like that, able to deposit online. And, I was just very fortunate. I actually, to get my first bankroll, there was a medical study being conducted on campus. where they took like two, you can't see, I guess, like on my forearm, but they took two skin grafts from each of my forearms, and they were testing like a diabetic cream for people with foot ulcers. So they were testing this new cream compared to Neosporin, which one would heal faster. And I got paid like $1,200 for it. So that was my initial like bankroll starter. Played some like, 25 cent, 50 cent games in the baseball house. And I won't say that I never looked back. I went broke a myriad of times, but that was good enough to get me through college. I had more money than I ever saw in my life by the time I was graduating.
So you literally had skin in the game right away.
Yeah, physically.
You mentioned that you had never drank alcohol. Did you drink? Was poker just that was your bridge?
Yeah, no, I've never consumed alcohol in my life. I've never really had a drug outside of caffeine. I've just always been like kind of on the straight and narrow. It was one of those things where like the curiosity just eluded me and still does to this day. I've never really felt like any sort of like compelling drive to test this stuff out. It just seemed like a net negative to me. But yeah, like poker was a huge, I guess, bridge in that way, where I was shy, especially going to college. I didn't like change. I came from a small school. It was hard to bridge that gap. So it was nice to have something that, whether I was or wasn't, I had convinced myself I was skillful at. And it allowed me then to kind of like socially blend in. And, just like the landscapes now, I feel like it almost prepared me in a way where I didn't have to lose in order to be liked or invited into these games, right? I just had to be the guy who had enough money to sit down and play. And, as I kind of like bridged the gap into high stakes, it was a lot of the same. It wasn't about being the guy who came and dumped money. It was about being the guy who could be a gracious loser amongst people who had more than enough money to gamble with, and to be a competitor and treat everybody equally, despite the fact that in life itself we might not be on a level playing field.
Yeah, and this is something that comes up a lot on this show, is respecting folks and just being cool. Being a fun person to play with is something that takes you shockingly far in the poker world as far as developing relationships and getting opportunities.
Yeah.
If you're just an asshole, then it's hard to play in private games. It's hard to get invited. It's hard to have a social life. It just compounds. Everything is so much harder when you're not just a cool, kind of easygoing, like you said, gracious loser. Because everybody's going to lose, right?
Sure.
Regardless of whether you're a favorite or not. So just be happy for folks when they win and shake it off and just focus and play hard, but control your emotions effectively.
It's a tough endeavor, right? It takes a lot of work and introspection and self-discovery to actually be able to get to that point. Because the fact of the matter is, whenever you're in an environment where you're getting to play some sort of nosebleed, almost nobody is going to be financially prepared for that. So you're going to be the one out on a limb, not your opposition. And that's going to do a few things. It's going to make you really heighten your competitive drive, which isn't really an appealing trait to everybody. Like, yeah, they want to feel like there's a battle taking place, but nobody wants to feel like they're being looked down upon, or that like you're so good that they don't stand a chance. So, there's a few things at play. Like, I just kind of grew up through the game with the idea of the old gambler's axiom of you got to give action to get action. And, taking that loss leader concept where you're willing to play more hands pre-flop than everybody else because you feel like you're able to recoup a lot of that EV post-flop. And yeah, that results in a lot of big swings and a lot of moments where you feel like the world's crashing down. One story in particular I'll never forget. The biggest pot I'd lost in my life up to that point, it was a $1.2 million pot where I had 4-bet pocket kings pre-flop against Roger Sipple, who is, a very wealthy man from California, businessman, but loves the game. He calls and the board comes down king, jack, 6 or something like that with the king of spades. And we get in a bunch of money on the flop. The turn is the queen of spades, putting king, queen of spades out. and now ace 10 or 10-9 to straight. And I check shove for like 400,000. And he calls. And I go, once or twice, Roger? And he goes, I don't know. I have a pretty good hand. I go, so do I. And he goes, what is it? And I table kings. And he goes, my hand's not so good anymore. And he has jack 10 of spades for a pair and a royal draw. And I'm like, okay, so twice? It's like, nah, just once. Oh. And I'm like, okay, fine, please don't do it to me. And the ace of spades just rips off on the river. And he jumps out of his seat. It's the happiest moment of his poker career. I'm at my lowest point for sure. And I like have to endure this guy like laughing like a hyena, taking pictures of the board, taking pictures of me shoving $500,000 his way and everything else. But it's like, that's a defining moment, because if I throw a tantrum or I hang my head or I physically get ill at the table or whatever the case may be, they'll enjoy that pain that I exude in that moment. But then they'll also have this like sour taste, especially if I'm like aggressively emotional, where it's like, I don't want to play with that kid. Like, I gave him action in a spot where I'm a big dog and I got lucky and he treated me like shit because of it. So it was quite the opposite, right? It's like, you almost get a guarantee to be in those games for a long time coming, because you're able to take those losses and you're able to just like understand like, hey, this might have been a defining pot in my career thus far, but as long as I can still get myself in action and have a chance to sit at the table, like there will be more defining pots down the line.
Yeah, you play the long term, and that is a giant pot. And also, you don't want to make it bittersweet for them either. Right. You make it bittersweet, it leaves it, like you said, it leaves a bad taste in their mouth. And at the end of the day, you obviously want to be in that game, and you want to be flopping top set and getting shit tons of action from jack 10 of spades. Yeah. Whether or not you want them to make a royal is a different matter. But tell me, you mentioned about being out on a limb in the first time that you're playing big. Do you have any memories or stories about, the first time you were playing big? Like, what was going on in your head? How did you deal with that?
Yeah, I guess I'll compartmentalize a little bit, because there's a difference between like the first time I played 25-50 on my own dime, where I might have had like $250,000 to my name, versus the first time I played 300-600, where I was in I don't even know what to call it. Like, calling it a backing deal almost isn't fair, because I was putting up a lot of the risk myself. But the 25-50, I don't remember very much. I just remember like it was my time. I had arrived. I felt like I was comfortable in the spot. And I got my head kicked in by Roble sitting immediately to my left, just 3-betting me to death the entire session. Yeah. So like I got humbled a little bit, but it was also really early in my career. It was like 2010. Fast forward then to like 2013, 14-ish, when I first got to play the big game. This was just way different. And thankfully, I was emotionally prepared for it. But that only takes you so far, right? Because no matter how emotionally in tune you are to how you're supposed to feel as a professional and how you're supposed to carry yourself, once you walk out of that room and are no longer surrounded by your business counterparts, and you're no longer expected to act like a professional, all of those emotions that you've been suppressing for the better part of X amount of hours just hit you like a brick wall. And, I can remember my first session very vividly. I was playing 200, 400. It was a 50K minimum buy-in. I put up half. And at the time, I probably had 300, 400,000 to my name. So not terribly large exposure, but pretty big, a little bit on the reckless side. I think I had like a total of 75K exposure for the session. And I flopped top two versus bottom set versus a guy that I thought to be really tight. And I just remember being in a situation on the river where I'm facing a 25K all in. And I just know I'm supposed to fold, and just try to suppress that feeling, because I think it's just my emotions getting the best of me. And I ultimately arrived at what's a theoretically correct call, and he just shows me bottom set. And I can just remember replaying that hand for weeks. But it's just like any other time that you take shots in your life. Eventually you become numb to the surroundings, and you just have to do a lot of the work off the table, where it's like, okay, I have a proper shot taking strategy. I know how much risk I'm in for. I've fleshed out what the worst case scenario can be, and I accept it. So now whenever I'm behind the glass doors. I'm just going to play as if I was playing my normal game, and whatever comes of it, comes of it. And once I was able to kind of like get to that point, it really altered everything. I've played some like ridiculous hands that if in the moment I knew, or I was more aware of like how much actual risk of ruin I was taking on, I probably would have just like bowed out and cowered and not made the correct play. But it's what we get paid to do, and it's really what you need to condition yourself from day one if you want to take this career path seriously.
There's a lot of things there. The psychological aspect of dealing with, you have top two against a tight player facing a 25K shove on the river, and telling yourself that, like theoretically this is a call. I feel like it's a fold in this spot. Is it my emotions? Is it because I'm playing big and
right.
that's affecting this decision? So there's a lot to go into play. How do you measure your risk of ruin? Like, what does that look like for folks?
Right. So, I mean, there are way more precise metrics than what I can give you off the top of my head. There are actual calculators and things like that you can take a look at. The Kelly criteria is obviously the benchmark for where we should begin examining risk of ruin. But even once you've done all of that work, there's still like this emotional risk of ruin that I would say is like pretty impactful, where when you cross certain thresholds of pain, it now becomes like detrimental, and there's a deterioration process that happens to your game. And, I can't imagine I'm the only one who's been victim of this throughout my career, but it was a big thing that like led me to working with Elliott Rowe in 2016, where I just seemed to have this innate ability to accumulate a lot of money very, very, very quickly. But as I hit certain thresholds, even if I didn't necessarily up my risk, my emotional risk seemed to be like greatly increasing. And I was almost like playing to maintain rather than to grow. And, keeping that mindset, even if it was subconscious, was very destructive. It would just put me in situations similar to this like top two versus bottom set where I couldn't trust myself because I was unaware of if I was just emotionally attached to this situation or if this was an actual read-based decision that I could make in game. And, after working with him a lot and kind of deprogramming that, I guess, like level of emotional tolerance that you have to the game, it became a lot more strategical, and I could just kind of pick apart the hand history and start making really exploitative calls, really exploitative folds, because especially in like 2013 to 16, whatever, that's what we were paid to do. I mean, that's what the environment allowed for.
Yeah. And for the most part in live poker, I feel like even today, it's still the way to be playing, whatever, up to 10 and a quarter even, or even bigger. You're playing live, you have a lot of information, and a lot of times the inclination I feel like is for folks to say, well, if I fold here, then that's very easy to exploit. It's not GTO and blah, 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 blah. But the thing is, like, the better information that you get, the better decisions you can make. And who cares if something is exploitative if all of your information tells you, look, like, this dude's got bottom set. Like, this is a fold, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the big misconceptions that kind of has gotten passed along with the whole GTO movement is that, A, we're capable of playing actual game theory optimally, which we're not.
Yeah.
And that B, that somehow it applies to the live realm in the sense that we need to protect ourselves, even against the best in the world. Like, of course, you have to be far more protected in your strategy construction, but that's simply because their counter strategies are a lot stronger, not because they recognize some sort of hole in your game and immediately lean into an exploit. They're not wavering either. Right. So it takes a lot of data and repetition in order to even begin to poke holes in whatever exploitative strategies we're conveying. So really the whole concept of like having balanced ranges and things like that, it's not to keep your opponent from like understanding like, oh, he does this action too much or that. It's more so just to have a strong strategy that won't allow a really strong opponent to kind of like step on your neck. But when you're against weak opponents, you should just do whatever your hand incentivizes you to do.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen a lot of that in the high roller scene too. These kind of top-notch guys who go on runs, it looks like they start doing something different than the field sooner. And I think largely what that different thing is just playing in a more hand versus range dynamic rather than range versus range.
And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, how many data points do you really get in a live setting? You don't even get a ton of data points in an online setting, typically, unless if you're playing in like a big Zoom pool, for instance. Mm-hmm. It's like, I think it's a misnomer, and I think it can be very hurtful to people's poker career, their earn rate and their win rate, when they just get stuck on this idea of GTO. Mm-hmm. And it's like, we're paid to make good decisions, and we're paid to maximize the value of our hand in certain situations. And sometimes, we may bet 1/10 on the river to induce a river raise, and we're not doing it with a bluff ever, but that's okay, right? Because our opponents are not going to realize that. They don't understand. So basically, you want to maximize the monetary decision in front of you instead of giving up EV for like some future spot that's never, ever, ever going to happen.
Right. I think like one of the best mantras that somebody can follow, and it should be what guides their study as well as their execution, is think theoretically and then execute exploitatively. And like if you're able to take that mindset and then work it into your line work, you're going to put yourself in some situations where like, you might take the slight worst of it, but it'll be an accident based upon the fact that your opponent just happened to have a certain region of their range, or they just like naturally fell into an exploit effectively on accident. But in a general sense, like you're going to maximize. You're going to find that bet size that they're willing to call. That's the maximum bet that they're willing to call. You're going to be able to, overbet exploitatively. You're going to be able to small bet exploitatively, and like all these things are really critical in the live environment.
Absolutely. Even in the online environment, for the most part. I mean, you have to really. It's like you have to run into a world-class player for it to really matter.
Yeah.
Oh, one thing I wanted to go back, I forgot. But anyway, sure. You mentioned early on in your poker career, by the way, in 2010. And I want folks to sort of let that seep into their brain, that you're 7 years in and you say it's early. Mm-hmm. So like, regardless of your success and how things are going in your own career after a few years, like there's a quote that I love that says, we always dramatically overestimate what we can do in a year and dramatically underestimate what we can do in 10.
Sure.
And, don't get down on yourself if you're a few years into your journey and things aren't going the way that you want them to go. Just keep battling. It works out. Like if you keep doing the work, it works out.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy for me to say that was early in my career because there was no fast tracking methods back then. Like you could be one of the lucky ones who got into a soft market, like all of us who got in at that time frame did, and had money to begin with. Because having liquidity at that point gave you more shots to fire, gave you more capacity to just play the highest stakes, or being the smartest guy in the room was going to be the fastest track to profit, right? But for most of us, the trajectory is going to look a lot more similar to mine, where it's like you're battling somewhere between a 10K and 100K roll for the first decade of your career. And it takes that monumental moment to kind of like springboard you through. It's a little different now in the sense that the market's a lot tougher, but there are also infinitely more metrics to kind of fast track things. Like there are kids probably 3 years into their career that have a lot of similar knowledge as people who are playing really high stakes. And the money factor is really the only separating thing. Back then, that wasn't true. It was largely like intuition, natural talent, the way that you were able to distill the game down into a mathematical language, despite the fact that there weren't really any trailblazers or guidelines set for you previously. So like 2010 for me was a big benchmark because I was dead broke in August of 2009, and Brent Hanks actually started backing me in online tournaments. And by February 2010, I had chopped the full tilt 750K for like 105,000. And it was the completion of like a 300K upswing in online tournaments. So I'd conquered a phase of my career at that point. Shortly thereafter, I got 41st in the main event. So like I conquered another phase. And now all of a sudden I had the liquidity available to me to start beating 10-20 no limit at the Bellagio on the regular. And that became like phase 3, which was where my heart and soul always was to begin with. So, for me, like that year was really the year where everything finally came together, opportunities aligned, and it was easy to say like, okay, I can confirm now that even if it's slightly biased, that, I am good at this game. It's a profitable market to be in, and the trajectory moving forward really skyrockets. Now I have the availability to play 10Ks. I have the availability to take shots at 50, 100, and all of that's very critical to the growth metrics of any sort of business.
Yeah. So tell me, so you went broke in 2009. Did you ever have any thoughts of quitting poker, going to something else?
Yeah, less so then, just because like I had been in the rinse repeat cycle for 6 or 7 years at that point. My biggest bankroll between 2003 and 2009 was only like 50K. And, I say only with an asterisk, but like back then, it's so hard to communicate this to younger generations now because they're in such a different landscape. But, to give you, to paint the picture, the first no limit game that I played in a casino was a 1-1 $40 min-max buy-in. So it was a 40 big blind game. The rake was $3 a hand, and they took $1 bad beat. So, this is unbeatable by today's standards. But in the game back then, when it was as soft as it was, people would fold on rivers to like a $6 all in an $80 pot.
Yeah.
And I crushed this game. I beat it for like $6,000, which is just unheard of. It's literally unfathomable now. And of course, like some of that is variance, or a lot of it is variance, whatever. But a lot of it was just the nature of the market. People thought very binarily about hands, where it's like either I have the best of it or I don't. And if I don't want to be all in, even if it's for my last $6. So, 50K, it wasn't a lot of money. I mean, that's what people would utilize to play like 1, 2, 2, 5 now. But I was playing like 5, 10, 10, 20 pretty regularly, basically recognizing like I'm young. I need to take on all the risk in the world now, because if I fail, it doesn't really matter. I have a computer science degree. Like I have a lot of other things I can do. I'm much more concerned returning 50 into 500 than I am worrying about going from 50 to 0, because it will only take me 10K to start up again. And that's an obtainable amount of money. So, I think I moved to Vegas in 2008, and I moved here with like 10K. By 2009, I was broke. I think my peak bankroll was like 2006. I had like 50K or so. So, I was just in the rinse repeat cycle. Once I had a lot of money in 2010, I think I was a little over 300,000 to my name. Now I felt like, okay, this is worth protecting. At the time I was 28 years old. So it's like, okay, I'm getting closer to my 30s. I need to be mature and responsible about this. Problem is like, at that point, I didn't have that education. My whole education up until that point was trying to get to this point.
Yeah, right.
And then just trusting yourself to do what's right. But, now I'm looking around, it's like, okay, well, I don't know what's right, but I know what I know. So I'll invest in poker. I'll invest in myself. I put like 150K into my friends who I thought were good and deserved an opportunity, backing them in like 5, 10, and then like, 3K tournaments and below. And then I took the rest and I just played like 10, 20, 40 and bigger with it. A lot of times I was playing like 25, 50, sometimes 50, 100. And, variance kicked in, like no shock. I went on a small downswing myself. I probably lost like, over that 18-month period, I probably lost like 40 or 50,000 playing cash. A lot of it actually in like 1 or 2 sessions. Just like as an example, I played 5, 10, 20 one day at the Venetian against a reg who I don't think currently plays anymore. When you hear the hand, you understand why. But in a hijack button scenario, we got in 25,000 each, where I had kings and he had 8K. And I asked him if he wanted to run it twice. He just goes, no. And just flopped me dead. It's just like ace, deuce.
Oh,
so,
God.
there were a lot of memories of that, but, the big element of it was just like losing piles through backing. In scenarios where like, again, I didn't know where else to invest my money, that I could potentially see the return that I would see backing. But the other half of it was like, I was kind of arrogant enough where it's like, well, if I'm a winning player and I think that they're close to being a winning player or slight winning players or whatever the case may be, then my money and knowledge combined with their ability to work will certainly lead to return. It's like, that's not true. Like, what would make them work is not giving them money and keeping them hungry and forcing them to prepare for the opportunity instead of just like dumping a bunch in their lap and saying like, okay, go nuts on the 510 street.
Yeah.
So, I lost Kyle's backing and I ended up going broke halfway through 2012. And like, that was the point where, that was probably the crux of my career in a lot of ways, at least from a self-discovery standpoint. Because like now I am 30 and I'm kind of asking like, what the hell are you going to do with yourself? You've been doing this or you've been going through this process for as long as you've been playing the game. And, you forget the fact that 50,000 isn't that much. And the times that you went broke off 20K is like pretty insignificant. And you just start to lump it all together in the narrative where it's like, you're always flush and then you're bust. You're flush and then you're bust. And it's like, well, this time that actually did apply because I went broke off 300K and that's pretty unacceptable, I think. But also still well within the realm of the stakes I was playing. And, I was firing hard. I wasn't just like trying to gradually grow. I still had the mindset of like 50K to 500. It's like, okay, well, this just becomes easier now that I have a little bit more security. So yeah, that year off where I just did nothing but study and a little bit of coaching on the side, it was miserable. And it was a lot of self-actualization and a lot of questioning, like, do I belong in this career? Do I actually have the talent for this? Where am I faltering? A lot of just poking holes at, where my mistakes have been made, where I falter as a human, where, maybe I'm not the perfect poker player for reason X, Y, and Z. And then, building off of strengths thereafter. And, a lot of that's like what led to the development of Solve for Why. By the time the summer of 2013 rolled around, I ended up having a massive World Series where I won like 500K. And I just had this Google Drive that was full of like, gigabytes of, I guess, like self-reflection and coaching metrics that I had tied together. And once I was able to get into the big game thereafter, it was like, okay, like this isn't just happenstance. This is a byproduct of hard work. And I kind of understand what it takes now.
And the fact that you could replicate your success over and over and over again, ignoring for a moment all of the plane crashes in between. The fact that you could replicate it over and over is kind of proof that you're doing something right?
Yeah.
And I think that even, staking those folks, like you said, you didn't really know what to do. You didn't have a plan, but you were attempting to scale, right? Like you're only one man. You can only play a certain number of hours per day, but that was an attempt to scale, which is not in and of itself a bad idea. It just, you just have to kind of have better guidelines and a better business model before you go into it. But yeah, so after that WSOP, you're flush again. Like there's obviously a narrative, a story that leads to you playing, a pot for $1.2 million, right? I mean, that is a fuckload of money. I mean, that is a massive, massive, massive pot. Like, was it just like straight rocket up from that point? Like, how did that journey go?
So, like I said, I went broke the World Series of 2012, and I spent a lot of time reflecting and just trying to grow as a person and as a player. And I had a couple good friends in the business world, Bob Bright being one of them, and then this guy, Michael Bertolini, being another. And
One second. Where did you meet these friends?
Playing poker, of course.
Right. So just like, let's hammer home this point of being a cool guy while you're playing poker, because so many side benefits of that. Okay, now go on.
So to like frame that a little bit better, Bob is worth hundreds of millions, and Michael Bertolini is like Joe Montana's manager. He basically just like has access to everybody. Like, it's not that he's so wealthy himself. It's more so that just like his network is priceless. He does work with Parcells, does work with Montana, like just all these guys who are connected to the ends of the earth. So the whole time I was broke, I'd been playing local games with Bob, like smaller, like 510 and below, for the better part of 6 or 7 years. He loved my action. We battled hard because, the stakes mean nothing to him. And I was just a chippy up and comer who like really enjoyed gambling. And he used to beg me to come play their big game. And at the time it was 100, 220K minimum buy-in. And like, I didn't want people to know I was broke. I just like very much kept to myself. I was like, someday, you know, I'm not ready for it yet. I would give a bunch of excuses, whatever the case may be. Leading up to that summer, Berto, Michael Berlini was able to like be the one to be a catalyst to like getting me into the series. He just randomly said like, I'm tired of losing. Here's $5K. I want you to be my coach on retainer. And I'm not taking no for an answer. It's like, this guy's one of my really good friends. So it's like, I would coach him for free.
Yeah.
But he just knew I needed help. And he knew I needed a jump start. And I turned that 5K into 50 very quickly. Final tabling an event at the win and then playing some cash. And then turned that 50 into 500, selling a package to the series. So once all of that was said and done, now all of a sudden I had like liquidity again. And I was where I was in 2010. And I knew like I didn't want to go the backing route. I was a lot more mature at this point. So what I understood was if I was going to start playing bigger like I wanted to, because all I ever cared about was progressing up the cash game ladder. It was never a concern of mine to just be like a tournament crusher. High rollers didn't even really exist yet. So for me, it was like, how do I make it from 5, 10, 10, 20 to the big game? And, you know, basically just what I understood was that leverage is everything. And being able to find a network of people who believe in you and then allow your 300,000 to be worth 3 million will give you great return. So Bob had been struggling in the big game. He reached out to me, asked me if I could, you know, help shore up some leaks in his game. And in return, he would give me like a small coaching fee. I was like, yeah, sure, that'd be great. And really in the back of my mind, all I'm thinking about is like, this is a great opportunity to kind of like reinitiate that conversation of me getting into the game myself. So after like a month or so of us working together, he's like, you know, we could really use a guy like you in the game who drives the action. Would you be interested? And I was like, yeah, of course. So he kind of like told me what the stakes were. I think they had bumped up to like 50K min at that point. And I just immediately reached out to Berto and I was like, look, man, I have this opportunity, but I don't want to fuck off all my money like I did the last time. You know, who do you know? What can you do? And he just pulled ties, found me some guys who like were believers. And suddenly I had a bankroll adequate enough to start playing these stakes. Where it got a little scary was I lost a little bit out of the gate, and a little bit is relative to the stakes. I think I lost like 2 buy-ins in my first 5 or 6 sessions. And then suddenly we're just playing 3, 6, 12, like every day.
Yeah.
Every day.
Wow.
It's just like, okay, I'm going to have to dilute myself more. It's like, I kind of backed into a bit of a self-inflicted business degree at this point. You know, it's like I had made all the mistakes, so I kind of understood how to run a startup, at least on a basic level. So it's like, all right, I'm going to have to dilute myself. We're going to have to get a lot more. But, you know, effectively, like I put 2 of my 300,000 up for like a return plus a free roll. And when we needed more money, I would just further dilute myself, and we just fired hard. So within, I would say 8 months rolling into the World Series of 2014, I was a staple in the game, playing pretty much every day, winning small. I might've been up like a few 100,000 or so, but that summer was just epic beyond words. In my 5 or 6 years in the game, since no summer has compared, it was just, it was the last summer that all the guys from Macau were allowed in the state still. That whole group that got busted, sports betting or running that ring out of Caesars.
Yeah.
So they were all here every day, just wanting to play 24/7, you know, so the game would just like run around the clock. And when seats needed to be filled, I was the first guys they would call. And man, I mean, just the level of sickness that was taking place at those stakes. I had my biggest win that summer. I think I won 1.6 million in one 3-6-12 session. And yeah, it was just nothing could really compare. The luster had worn off after that 3-month grind.
How did it feel that summer? Like what were the thoughts going through your head as you're like, you know, enjoying your breakout summer?
I think that's the biggest problem with being a professional poker player is like, you don't get to enjoy it. You know, I'm on pins and needles every single day because I don't know if I'm going to have a seat. I don't know if this hot run can continue. I recognize that like I can't possibly get a hold of enough money to where my risk of ruin is so low that this is just like risk-free money. You know, so like every decision's critical. Every lineup I sit in matters. My seat draw like matters. So like just running hot in those situations, in a lot of ways, like kept me in action for a longer period of time than maybe I otherwise would have if things had been a little bit different. So yeah, I mean, it's more anxiety than joy and I guess like any sort of retribution. Reflectively, I was able to kind of look back after the series had calmed down and the game had slowed down a little bit. And it's like, wow, that was fucking crazy.
Yeah.
Like, the amount of 7-figure pots that I played over that stretch, it was just like, this is a nuts way to go about it. But, you know, the fact that I'm only 10% invested, 15% invested, whatever, it's like, it's relative too.
Yeah. It's still, no matter how invested you are, it's still probably fucking nuts to play a 7-figure pot. I mean,
yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know what to compare it to. Nothing else. The only thing that ever compared to it was playing the bubble of the Super High Roller Bowl, just because I was out on a limb on that one too. I took way too much of myself and really just fired hard on this notion that I could compete.
And you said something too, like about poker players, and this is like, back when I was coaching a lot, I don't really do one-to-one coaching anymore, but I would always have my students, I'm like, please remove EV from all of your databases. Don't look at it, because you're only going to feel one of two ways. You're either going to feel bad because you're running below EV, or you're going to feel bad because you're running above EV, and you think that like the bottom's going to fall out at any point, right? Yeah. So like there is no feeling good looking at this EV graph, and if it's not going to make you feel good, just get rid of it. And plus, it's kind of bullshit anyway. It's not really accurate data, but yeah, it's like you're when things are going well, you can always like wait for the other shoe to drop, you know, as a poker player.
Yeah, and it's a sickening feeling because like we're just so fundamentally flawed. Just I mean, it keeps us from being sociopaths, but just our limbic system as a whole is just so detrimental to our day-to-day operations as far as like trying to keep things rational and try to keep everything in perspective. You know, that fight or flight system kicks in, and just all of a sudden, like we just turn into cavemen.
Yeah, it's tough. Never underestimate just how tough it is to play this game and deal with the things that you inevitably have to deal with. And like you mentioned, the limbic system, and it's impossible to play GTO. And this is 100% accurate too, right? Like there's no spot where, you know, you should raise 31% of the time. You can't randomly generate a number 1 in 100 as a human being. It's impossible. Right. We're awful at being random anyway. So it's like, you know, a lot of the GTO stuff, and this kind of goes back, is like, it's impossible to implement. And yet we're spending hundreds of hours studying it when you can't even successfully implement it correctly. Yeah,
I think the biggest challenge is that we just don't necessarily have a better systematic approach, or at least not one that people are willing to be all in on. Like this is data driven, so people can very easily be all in on it. Whereas, you know, if you play live, like the best data that you can acquire is the information from the players around you. Like the one thing the human brain is very good at is observation. Now, of course, it's going to come with its own biases, but those biases are what helped get us here. So, you know, in a lot of ways, like if you're in tune to your environment, there's a lot of very profitable information that you're going to be able to accumulate that's then going to allow you to dictate where you fall on that exploitative spectrum and start making better, more calibrated decisions over and over again, as opposed to just like worrying about how perfect your mix is.
Yeah, 100%. What is up, you future star of poker, you? Coach Brad here, and I just wanted to take a moment to let you know about PKC Poker. If you're sitting there wondering, why is Coach Brad promoting this PKC Poker app thing? Allow me a moment to explain my why. Battling in cash games has been my livelihood for the past 15 years. It's how I survive and put food on the table, which makes it imperative that I either test out or seek qualified opinions on all of the poker platforms on the market. One juicy find can mean the difference between a meh year and an amazing family vacation in Hawaii kind of year. With that said, I've tried almost all the major poker apps on the market to date, and despite the hype about amazingly juicy games, I've come away from the experience unsatisfied. I was just never able to find amazing success against seemingly weak competition, and in one specific case was getting outright destroyed by passive villains playing more than 50% of their hands. What the heck was going on? After many evenings sitting in the bathtub, wondering if I had lost it, I finally dug into the data and learned something that shouldn't have been too surprising to you. These dudes were colluding and super using their pants off. So I swore off those free money, decentralized devil apps and decided to go back to my more familiar streets of Ignition. It was then that I was contacted by a good friend of mine who turned out to be the vice president of worldwide operations at PKC. Him and I had a long, in-depth conversation about security, the ecosystem, and the future direction of PKC, and he managed to convince me to give it a shot. That shot turned into an incredible 6 months with an hourly rate that's about 5 times what it would have been playing on any other US platform. As it turns out, I didn't forget how to play. I just needed a level playing field to return to my crushing ways. I have no doubt that you, my community, my audience, is going to play poker somewhere, and I want to be damn sure that you don't go through the pain and frustration I felt by messing around with any poker app besides PKC. This is why promoting PKC is a no-brainer. I love my community, and I want to put you in the best position to succeed at this game that we both love so much. So if you'd like to join me in the streets of PKC, simply head to enhanceyouredge.com/PKC and get your invite code to play. You must have an invite code, and you must be 21 years of age or older. One more time, that's enhanceyouredge.com/PKC. Best of luck, and now, on with the show. So, nowadays, what is your process? And actually, this could apply to before too, like when you're experiencing sort of the exponential growth as a poker player.
Right.
What did that process look like for regularly improving your game?
So I can confidently say that, like, prior to going broke in 2012, nothing I did mattered, right? So it was a lot of internalization. It was a lot of hand discussions. It was a lot of just trying to get my mind wrapped around the concept of variance, but none of it really mattered. Like, yeah, sure, it made me better in the sense that I was gritty. I was able to keep showing up. I was able to keep plugging away. But the reason why I won is just because I had a natural intuition or inclination to the game, right? I was literally just playing a game of wits and wagers against people who were less witty than me. As the game matured, and as I personally matured, for me, what it was, or what the breaking point was dedicating like hundreds of hours to actually self-actualizing. And the reason why I think that's so important is because it's not until you're able to, kind of like openly state your flaws with no emotional attachment whatsoever, that you'll actually be able to sit down and put in the work necessary to achieve a higher bottom line in this game. It's so simple to just fool ourselves based on whatever the outcome has been thus far, whatever repetitive pattern we think we're observing. All of this is still fundamentally flawed. Of course, there's going to be some, some truth to it, but it also depends like how you're taking in those sources, right? Like, is this something that is just your memory? Because that's going to be greatly skewed. Is this something that's like based off of your spreadsheet of tracking your results? Because again, like, not the devil's really in the details in those scenarios. If you see that you're making $30 an hour at 510, but you don't recognize that, like, of the 1,000 hours you played, the vast majority of your profit came from the 100 hours you played having position on a drunk guy who dumped 10 buy-ins,
right?
Then that metric means absolutely nothing, right? And you can't really even say like, okay, well then just pluck out the outlier scenarios, because it's like, well, that doesn't really mean anything either, because now we might be looking at like a 600-hour sample. And who gives a shit, right? Like the 100 hours you spent playing against the drunk guy is very fucking important to your bottom line. So like, it's not good enough to just pluck that out. It's good enough to say like, I have a skill set whenever this environment presents itself. So I think like just becoming very intimate and secure with the areas that I felt comfortable and confident versus the areas that I felt weak. allowed me then to like really reverse engineer strategy. And effectively the way that I went about it was like a top-down holistic approach where I don't want to examine micro learning of, how should I be playing small blind versus button open? How should I be playing blind versus blind? That stuff's all very important, but it means nothing without context. It means nothing without a larger why behind it. So for me, I just like really started from the root of, what do I want to achieve when I sit down? And what I recognized early was that you're rewarded live for putting in the most volume of hands. So I don't mean being dealt the greatest volume, because I don't think that that's very controllable. Whether you play 1,500 hours or 2,000 hours is still a pretty insignificant sample size. You're talking about very few hands over the aggregate. But what I'm talking about is, of the hands that you're dealt, being able to play a higher volume of them than the nit, than the tight reg, than all these other players at the table was very important to me, because it meant that I was going to be vying for more pots against players that I considered to be weak. And through that, I would be able to develop strategies that better expose their weaknesses, better play to my strengths, and things along those lines. So, I basically just started to form from big to little. And it was like, all right, well, what's a normal opening range under the gun look like? How far can I expand? And what mistakes from the field am I expecting to occur that will allow me to do so? And in 2013, like, that stuff was all very predictable. It was like, well, we're going to have these three profile types. Some are going to fold ace jack versus my open. Some are going to call ace jack versus my open. And some are going to 3-bet ace jack versus my open. I just need to be able to pinpoint where these people are at the table, and then figure out like how that's going to interact with my under the gun opening range, my middle position opening range, et cetera. And, it all just took off from there. With the advent of solvers, I was able to get a lot more, I guess, precise with it. But so did the field. The field stopped folding ace jack to an open. The field stopped only calling because they're all passive. And that forced adjustments on my end too. But it's way, way, way easier to adjust off of the groundwork baseline than it ever will be to recreate the baseline. And I feel like that's maybe the scary part that newer players should be worried about, is that they're all kind of skirting that learning phase where, they're just getting out there and they're kinesthetically absorbing a lot and thinking about the game deeply because they're forced to. And instead, they're just like grinding solves. And it's like, if at some point the baseline metrics for those solves change, and they will, because
players
that's
change.
the nature. That's the nature of discovery, right? Like we're so, people think this game's so close to solve. It's so laughable. It's like, okay, like show me your multi-way solves and I'll poke holes in them for days. But it's like, as we discover more, that baseline is going to look less and less and less like it did whenever you first got in. And that's what you've been building off of from day one. So if you don't have the principles behind it, the whys and the whats and the hows, then you're just going to constantly be victim to old information. And then you're going to have to reinitiate the learning curve all over again. So if every 2 to 3 years you're going through this cycle of relearning things that you've already learned, just so that you can get proficient at whatever the current state of the game is, you're going to quit. You're going to quit, or you're going to go broke, or you're going to do both.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very, very intelligent way to go about. I think about it like conditions. When I'm playing, there are certain conditions in every single game, and you can be playing a certain way, and a loose aggressive player stands up directly on your right, and a tight player sits in, and now the condition for the game has changed, and your strategy changes as well. And every single, that's why like people want cut and dry answers all day long. They want black and white, but the reality is like the makeup of the game changes constantly, which also changes your strategy and changes how you adjust. And so having that top-down strategy is super clever, super smart, because then you're able to adjust with the game no matter who sits down and all these different little puzzle pieces.
Yeah, and I don't mean to frame it in such a way where like everybody else got it wrong and I got it right. That's not true at all. Like, the elites are the elites for
sure,
a
of
reason.
Course, right.
What I'm saying is that the mimicking process is very, very fallible.
Oh,
and that's
it's
what
huge.
The vast majority, and that's what the vast majority of the community is doing, right? They're not thinking deeply and thoughtfully. They're just saying like, oh, Chris Kruk likes a 30% mix here, so I'm going to plug that in and I'm going to go that approach.
Yeah, it's monkey see, monkey do without realizing all of the things that go into it. Because, for instance, doing a Twitch stream or even making like narrating a training video, you cannot get all of the thoughts out of your head that are going in your head, right? You're like, I like a 3-bet here. Well, there's a million conditions and a million reasons why you like a 3-bet versus a flat or versus a fold in a specific situation. And you just can't verbalize it. So people will say, oh, well, this is a good spot to cold 4-bet. I saw Berkey cold 4-bet here, so I'm going to cold 4-bet here. But like without understanding the conditions that led to that cold 4-bet, and then they get smashed and they're like, what? Why do I suck? Why is he so good and why do I suck? Because you didn't fundamentally understand the why. Which I guess makes sense for the name of your training site, right?
That's really what it's all about. We're just trying to create heuristics that we can lean on when it's all said and done. So rather than trying to examine these things from such a tight vantage point or zoomed in scope, we want to be adaptable. That's the biggest thing, right? So it's like, if it goes raise 3-bet and we're in a cold 4-bet situation, we want to have heuristics in place or protocols where we can just say like, okay, what are the things that we need to consider first? Our opponents, or the formation, right? So the positional awareness of both our oppositions and ourselves. Profiles are probably a really big indicator here as to what we're able to do. How often is this guy 3-betting? Is it too wide? Is it too tight? Is he relatively close to calculated? And then like we want to start looking at hand properties. Like, okay, well, how does my hand rank as far as the cold 4-bet candidate goes? Does it have showdown value? Is it suited? Is it connected? Like, how do all these properties work in? And eventually you're just going to arrive at a conclusion. And the biggest thing that people need to understand is like the conclusion you arrive at is you're good is going to be accurate like 55, 60% of the time. Like that's what's going to make you good, is that you're getting it right more often than you're getting it wrong. Not that it's a binary black and white spot where like, oh, this is a clear 4-bet and these are clear folds. It's like, yeah, you get aces in that spot sometimes. What else? It's like, that's just not how poker works. It's a dynamic game, and there are so very few situations that are cut and dry outside of the nuts. And again, going all the way back to the limbic system, it's why people yearn for that sensation of what it's like to be facing aggression on the river with the stone cold nuts. Because it's the first time you kind of get to take a sigh of relief and just go, oh, I know the answer. I know the answer unequivocally is to just raise. And then you have to go through the variable nature of like, well, what's my raise size to? And it's like, then the anxiety builds up again. It's like, what if I don't maximize the spot? What can I do to control the fact that like I need him to call, but I still want to maximize my earn? And that little exercise in and of itself should tell people just like how much margin of error there is in any and all decision points in this game.
Yeah. You want to have a high batting average. Nobody's going to get it right every time. And just talking about all the data and like the formation and the 3-bet percentage of villain number 2, like we also have to take into consideration villain number 1, right? It's villain number 1, a super aggressive wreck, and then villain number 2 is a pro who's trying to isolate and take advantage. And then now how does this affect us? And like there's just so much all the time as far as information and data that goes into these decisions. And like, you watch it on a YouTube video and it's like, oh, 4-bet. Like you think, that's a great spot to 4-bet. I'm going to start doing that too. This is a great spot to check raise. I'm going to do that too without knowing what's really going on.
Yeah, in my opinion, this is why live poker will always flourish, is because deductive reasoning conquers all. So the ability to deduce what's going on in game and arrive at conclusions that are winning more than they're losing is really what this whole game distills down to. And no amount of solves or programs or any sort of cheat codes are available for people to do this with any level of consistency. So as long as that's the case, as long as we don't reach the singularity where we're running live HUDs in
Google glasses on.
Yeah. As long as that doesn't happen, then the truest, most intelligent and brightest in the game are going to be heavily rewarded. Where that fails maybe is at the high roller circuit, but understand that they were rewarded the whole process through until arriving at that point.
What should folks do to improve their, and this is like a maybe unanswerable, but their deductive reasoning? What process does that look like?
I think first and foremost, everybody should be very intimate with the scientific method. I can't think of a better approach to a theoretical game than walking through that process of hypothesize, test, implement, retest, revisit conclusions, and rinse and repeat, right? Like just going through that top-down approach where you have a focus, but it's blurry, and you're open to the idea that results may vary. I think that's critical. I also think like doing a lot of things that aren't necessarily poker related will really improve the expansion of like people to deduce logically. So just playing logic games in a general sense, even if it's something a little bit like one-off, like playing like Connect Four. I remember like the first time that like game theory really struck a chord with me. Well, maybe not the first time, but the first time I married it to poker directly was Connect Four in my group of friends was like really big in 2010. And a couple of us were very, very, very good, and everybody else was like very random. And it dawned on me what was taking place was literally they were random. Their first move was never pre-programmed. Their second move never really had much correlation to the first. And the ones of us that were good had like patterns. And I was just like, of course, this is solvable. Like, you know, and I knew, I guess inherently, like I have a background in this kind of stuff, but like you just overlook that when you're in the heat of the moment of the game, right? I was 26. I wasn't necessarily thinking that way. I was happy to be out of school. But it dawned on me one day where it's like, no, wait, this is unequivocally solvable. This is just a gigantic tic-tac-toe board. And, you know, starting to think that way and then having a hunger to like actually pursue more optimal solutions, it ruins the game for you in some way. But at the same time, like it expands your capacity to think. And then just like lastly, if you're a passive learner who just likes to like kinesthetically absorb things and stuff like that, like sports is so fantastic, man. There are just like so many illogical things that take place in sports. Especially, I have a baseball background, and I just think like the parallels between baseball and poker, two games of failure, where variance often chooses winners in the short run, but in the long run, like you can very much scrutinize each and every decision point. Like if you're able to like actively watch and engage in these scenarios, watching a football game, not recognizing when they're taking the high AEV line versus the low one, fourth down conversions are like, you know, the most obvious and egregious, but there are plenty of other ones like, you know, being in third and long, knowing that you have to go forward and fourth and airing the ball out. It's just like, you know, that's obviously lower EV than just trying to cut the yardage in half and having a manageable fourth down. I think like putting yourself in that framework as often as possible that doesn't directly correlate to poker, because it can get exhausting just constantly running through flops, turns, and rivers. I think it's a way to like re-engage that active part of your rational mind.
I love that. It's like it's immersing yourself in strategy that's not just poker,
right?
Applying it to different areas. Yeah, that is because you don't want to burn out, and you don't want to live only poker because that can be kind of boring.
Yeah,
but
yeah, and I think understanding investment strategies is massive too, right?
Really?
So if you can understand markets and like the way that it all falls back on ROI and EV, no matter what you're talking about, right? So I think like one of the most egregious things that I've come to find as a coach now for 4 or 5 years is how misunderstood the pot odds model is across the board when you're talking about players who are at mid stakes and below. A lot of them are good despite the fact that they refuse to understand how the investment model works in accordance to pot odds. And it's just like, this isn't hard. This isn't like, you know, any sort of like laborious math. This is pretty simplistic stuff that should be a prereq to anybody considering themselves a professional. But like, it's just insane how often I'll present a scenario. Like my go-to these days have been like, you arrive at a flop, you have the nut flush draw on a dry texture, say like 10 deuce 3, you have ace 8 of clubs and 10 3 of clubs, and your opponent shoves all in for 2x the pot. Do you have the right price to call? The amount of people who just like snap say no, it's just like so clear that they're just driven by fear and risk aversion and never ever put in a single second of thought as to like what the right price actually is. Right?
What villain's shoving with? What's his range? What are his previous patterns?
Right. And it's just like, okay, well, then you have to break it down further. It's like, well, what's your equity if you're in a worst case scenario? It's like, about 38%. It's like, okay, let's go with that. So what price do you need to be laid on the pot? Roughly 3-2. Okay. So what price are you getting here? Let's see. Shoving for 2 pots. There's 1 pot out there. So it looks like I'm getting about 3-2. It's like, yeah. So what should you do? And it's just like this mind blowing moment where it's like, oh, I'm allowed to call with a non-made hand versus an overbet? That's insane. It's like, no, that's math. That's literally just math.
Like you said, people think about things in a binary way where it's like, there's, like you were talking about earlier, there's $80 in the pot and you're shoving for 6 and it's binary. I'm either right or I'm wrong. Right. And it's like, no, you need to be right like 7% of the time. Like, you got to hit 7, you got to bat 7% here. And people don't like being wrong. And another thing about the scientific method that I found is people don't like testing when they can be wrong. Like, this is why I think people play nittier and tighter, because they're afraid of making a giant mistake. Right. And that to me is such a massive, massive mistake, because number one, it hinders your growth as a poker player. And number two, you don't get to expand. You don't get to go deeper in the decision tree. You don't get to think. You miss plus EV spots because you never take them. Right. And that's going to hurt you in your career. I'm not saying be a maniac, but I'm saying, like, if you have a theory where you think it's plus EV, then test the theory out and see, and then think about it, and then, analyze it, and then move forward from there. Like, in a worst case scenario, okay, you're punting some money. In a best case scenario, you're learning something that's going to earn you thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars over your career. So, like, it's a worthy attempt.
And I mean, it's a double-edged sword too, because it's like, it's what keeps the dead money flowing. So it's no shock that tournaments are the most popular form of poker. Why? There's a fixed investment and you're incentivized to just survive in a lot of ways. So that disincentivizes post-flop play, which reduces the game tree in a lot of scenarios. And EVs, when you're talking about just like push-fold charts, are going to run relatively close. So it's like, no mistake is really all that egregious. And that just keeps people coming back for more, because the game does seem a lot more binary. It seems a lot more solvable. If you hear like average or below average tournament players discussing hand histories, all it ever is like, could I have gotten away from this relatively nutted hand in this scenario that would have kept me in the event longer? Like, could I have just folded jacks off my 15 blinds facing an open? Like, what are we even talking about? Like, you just view the game through a different lens than I ever will, or I guess a different lens that I've evolved into. I'm sure at some point in my career I thought that way, but also the market was very different when I thought that way. Like, people were making errors so large that edges could be derived by thinking deeply about, like, can I do something that seems crazy?
Yeah, it's like we said, people don't want to make mistakes. They don't want to feel dumb. They don't want to look like a fool. So that's what leads to them asking these kind of like ridiculous questions, like the jacks. Like, oh, could I just fold it to an open? And there's a bias, right? There's the bias once you see that they have aces. Like, fuck.
That's the big part. The negative feedback loop is so detrimental in this game, because even like when you're right, it's still negative feedback. It doesn't confirm anything, but now this confirmation bias is just ingrained in you.
Right. And the negativity bias too, it sticks with us. We can make 10 great plays and then do something silly, and then that one silly thing is what we remember for the next 5 years. Right. It's just how the human brain is built.
Well, it evolved us to keep us alive, like you have a scare with a tiger because you left your cave during the night, and it's like suddenly you stop doing that.
Yeah, don't leave your cave at night anymore. Right. It's just too bad that we weren't evolved to be superhuman poker players, right?
That were the case.
All right, let's ask a couple questions and then wind down.
Okay.
What's your current big goal as related to your poker career?
Man, I have to tell you, like, I love the game. I'm super passionate about it, but so many of my goals are like out of my control that it's really difficult to call them goals. So it's like I don't really get to control if and when I have seats I don't really get to control my volume whenever it comes to like high stakes cash and stuff like that. And I don't really have the desire to like get on the high roller circuit. Maybe that'll change. I mean, maybe at some point I'll realize like these guys are the best of the best and I want to be able to hang my hat saying I can compete with them. But like my ego at 37 is not the same as it was at 27. I know where my lane is, and then like it's always been deep stack cash. So, you know, largely like I just want to be able to play the biggest games in the world consistently. But in a big aspect, like that's out of my hands, both from an availability standpoint as well as like a funding standpoint. It's not easy to just accrue. You know, for a lot of these games, like you need to have like 5 million working roll in order to ensure that like you're not going to go broke anytime soon. But I would say my bigger goals as a whole, I kind of am really into the idea of like solving the problem as to how poker can become more marketable. I just find it so ridiculous that this game has this cultic following that is so niche in nature, and it's so enthralling. Like when you're able to kind of peel back the curtain and see the characters and how they've made it thus far, all of the stories are just like super compelling. You know, we have so many of them. They're just endless. Like, you know, whether it's guys like Seaver and Ike, who were roommates at Brown and now are two world elites, or you know, other guys like the kind of older school generation like Dean Eggs and Mattisau and the different paths that they've taken. It's just
Doyle, you know, even older Doyle. He's
right. Yeah, it's like we could cherry pick hundreds of guys who deserve it. But most importantly, it's like if we start to dive into the high roller circuit right now, I don't know anything about these guys. Like even a guy like Bonomo, who I've been familiar with since the day I started playing because we're about the same age. It's like all I really know from a bullet point resume standpoint is that Z Justin was a multi-accounter and Justin Bonomo is the all-time second most winning live tournament player. And like the in-between is just like shrouded in consistency, I guess. Like, yeah, he just like played tournaments and won for many, 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 many years. But it's like, there's way, way, way more going on there. And to me, it just seems sinful that things like NASCAR, things like, you know, I guess even to a lesser degree, like secondary sports like volleyball or WWE or whatever, like, these things are flourishing and hundreds of millions of people are spending money to view. And it's like, I really feel like the biggest challenge for poker is just coordination. And it's something that like the top just doesn't want to do. Tours refuse to coordinate with themselves. Casinos refuse to coordinate. You know, then it falls down to the next level of like upper management who's making rules and things like that. I mean, it just seems like really problematic that we're so individualistic.
And a lot of times we lack a proper narrative. Like you mentioned about Z Justin, right? It's a multi-accounter who got in trouble, and then Justin Bonomo, the second winningest poker player of all time. There's no narrative in between. We don't focus on that story of the journey to know him as a human being. And, you know, if you watch like one of my shows that I love on Netflix that came out maybe a month or so ago is a show called Hyperdrive. And
I love that show. It's amazing.
Right. And so if you watch
cinematography is incredible.
Oh, it really is. Like
like they're taking something relatively boring, but man, the shots are just insane.
Yeah, it's an awesome show. And like in the beginning, you're like, come on, man, I don't want to know this dude's story. Like, let's get into the races. I don't want to know it. But that story is so necessary because that's what compels you to keep watching. You want to know if your characters are going to do well on the next episode. And then it's what builds the anticipation, the anxiety when they're running their race, right?
It's like they have racing to back them, right? Like that's actually something relatively exciting. You can see successes and failures just based on times, based on like how they perform. Poker's not that aesthetic.
Yeah.
So like we really, really have to shift the narrative away from the actual gameplay, distill it down to clips, edited shows, whatever the case may be. But like the vast majority of the content out there definitely should be on the career itself, like what it takes to live this alternate lifestyle and, you know, the glory, the fame, and all of the pitfalls and failures that come along with it as well.
Because that is compelling. And I mean,
Right.
Even like the cult show, the 2 months, 2 million show, I mean, people remember it. I think it was, I didn't care for it myself, but again, that was a narrative, right? That was a story that they put together, and that was compelling in and of itself. And that's what makes human beings remember it, because we're very story driven as a species. And it's just, poker needs to do better. And I think that is sort of what increases the marketability. And it's not, we get fixated on the game itself. We get fixated on a high stakes game without telling the story behind all the players that are playing.
Agreed.
So you have a rooting interest.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And you mentioned that you had your eyes set on some keynote speaking and stuff like that too, right?
Yeah, I did my first keynote middle of June, I believe, or late June. Somebody from the San Francisco Recovery Center just randomly stumbled upon the blog I wrote about my mom who OD'd from drugs, and they have an annual recovery summit where it's friends, families, and recovering addicts all in the same room, basically just like talking about their journey, celebrating it, and everything else. And he read the blog, was moved by it, asked me to be a keynote speaker, which I had at that point never done, and just gave me 45 minutes of stage time. And I really, really enjoyed it. I mean, ultimately, I'm very driven by helping others, but not necessarily so much on a small scale. I kind of struggle with the idea of giving a man a fish versus teaching a man to fish for a lifetime kind of concept. Like, I walk past a homeless person on the corner, my heart breaks for them, but I don't feel necessarily compelled to give them $20 because I don't think we're getting to a root cause solution there. But I would happily try to put a lot of brain power and money behind something that can potentially give him a place to stay instead of living on a corner or whatever the case may be. And I don't think there's anything wrong with facilitating the Band-Aid. It's just not my mission, right? Like, I think there's plenty of other people out there where that's what they're happy with. That's where they're comfortable. For me, it's like, I really enjoy examining root causes and trying to find big picture solutions. And yeah, I think being able to speak to a lot of people, and even if it's just using my past experience or again, narratives and story driven type of messages, I think a lot of good can potentially come from it.
So let's take a long view here. Just two questions left. Let's take a long view from now until the time that Berkey's an old man. What would you like to have accomplished at the end?
Man, that's big. I would like to say that I impacted society as a whole in some notable way. And that's super lofty. And I definitely don't have my finger on the pulse of what that way would even be. But I definitely have a drive for it. Like, it's something that gets me out of bed in the morning. And it's something that I feel like anyone who is of reasonable intelligence and relative empathy is probably struggling with on the regular, where it's like, well, I personally don't matter that much, but we as a whole certainly do. How can I contribute to that greater good in a meaningful, impactful way through the resources that I've been gifted? So whether that's intellect or privilege or a podium or whatever the case may be. So it's hard because, as somebody who is used to solving problems and used to taking action, it's very difficult to figure out how the hell you're going to contribute to society in a way meaningful, similar to like a Bill Gates or whatever the case may be. But I'm kind of a firm believer in the sense that, like, as long as you're mindful and thinking about it, opportunities will kind of present themselves, and then the snowball effect will kind of take over.
Yeah, again, cognitive bias. You think about things, you think about these problems, it's a moonshot, right? It's a moonshot. You don't know how you're going to get there, but you're focused on the problem. And then as you go and live your life, you start seeing things, and then you start making connections. And then over time, those connections can maybe lead to a path that leads to a possible solution or a possible theory. And then you just go from there. But having that target in mind is so helpful in noticing things, because as human beings, we really don't notice a lot, and we notice what we think about. So just having that in mind, and I hope you can pull it off, because I like society. I would like society to be improved, right?
Of course.
I don't think there's anybody out here listening that's like, no, fuck society, let it burn.
Right.
But yeah, man. So final question. Where can the Chasing Poker Greatness audience find you on the World Wide Web?
You can find me on all social at Berkey11. And then you can also find me, as far as like training and stuff like that goes, at solve4yacademy.com or tv.solve4yacademy.com.
I've loved this very, very much. And let's do a round 2 in a year or so.
Yeah, I can't wait. I really enjoyed this podcast. Questions were great, very thoughtful. Looking forward to seeing how this whole podcast thing shapes out for you.
Thanks, man. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Chasing Poker Greatness. If you haven't yet subscribed to the show, please take a moment to do so on Apple Podcasts or wherever your favorite place to listen to podcasts may be. And once again, I also wanted to let you know about PKC Poker. If you're on the lookout for a new platform where the games are safe and secure and the action is amazing, head to enhanceyoredge.com/PKC to get your code and jump into the games. You must have a code to play, as well as be 21 years of age or older. One final time, that's enhanceyoredge.com/PKC. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time on Chasing Poker Greatness.